Gwen's breath came faster, her chest tightening as Victoria remained completely unfazed. The billionaire's lack of reaction, the way she refused to cower or even acknowledge Gwen's supposed authority, was infuriating. The weight of the other passengers' eyes pressing in around her only made it worse. Victoria wasn't arguing, wasn't raising her voice. She was simply existing in a space that Gwen had already decided she didn't belong in, and that alone was unbearable. Her fingers twitched at her sides as her frustration turned into something sharper, something reckless. Then, before she even realized what she was doing, Gwen's hand shot forward, her palm smacking hard against Victoria's cheek. The sharp crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from every direction. The businessman dropped his newspaper. The socialite clutched her pearls. A young black woman near the galley instinctively took a step forward, her face frozen in horror. No one moved. No one spoke. Victoria's head turned slightly from the impact, but she didn't recoil. She didn't reach for her cheek or show any sign of pain. She simply sat there, breathing evenly, her body perfectly still. Gwen's own breath hitched, her palm tingling from the force of the slap, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered through her gaze. Slowly, too deliberately, Victoria turned her head back to face Gwen. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto the flight attendants with a quiet, measured intensity. There was no fury in her expression, no humiliation, just a calm, lethal calculation that sent a ripple of cold unease down Gwen's spine. Victoria exhaled through her nose, her lips pressing together briefly before she reached into the pocket of her coat, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. The cabin remained silent, every passenger watching, holding their breath. Victoria lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice, when she spoke, was smooth, steady, and absolute. "This is Victoria Lawson. Handle this immediately." But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a powerful story like this one. The private jet sat on the runway like a sleek, polished masterpiece, its smooth silver exterior gleaming under the soft glow of the evening lights. The aircraft wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and exclusivity, reserved only for the elite. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of opulence. Plush leather seats stretched across the spacious interior, arranged for maximum comfort and privacy. Subtle gold accents lined the edges of the overhead compartments, and the soft hum of ambient music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the low murmurs of well-dressed passengers sipping on aged whiskey and imported champagne. Every detail, from the scent of fresh orchids placed meticulously near the windows to the personalized service provided by the hand selection crew, screamed affluence. As the final passengers boarded, Victoria V. Lawson stepped into the cabin, exuding a quiet yet undeniable presence. She was a woman who didn't need to announce her power. It clung to her like a second skin. Dressed in a tailored ivory pantsuit that fit her statuesque frame flawlessly, her rich brown skin glowed under the warm lighting. A sleek Rolex peeked from beneath her cuff, understated but undeniably expensive. She moved with effortless grace, her chin slightly lifted, her back impossibly straight, each step measured yet unhurried. To those unfamiliar with her, she might have seemed like just another successful executive, but for those who knew, she was much more. A billionaire, the CEO of one of the most influential investment firms in the world, and, most importantly, the owner of the very airline she was flying on. Standing near the front of the cabin, Gwen Hayes, a senior flight attendant with over 2 decades of experience, watched Victoria closely. At 48, Gwen had long perfected the art of reading people, or so she thought. Her neatly pinned blonde hair and crisp uniform were impeccable, and her sharp blue eyes scanned every passenger with practiced precision. She prided herself on maintaining order in the exclusive world of private aviation, where only the truly deserving occupied first class. And yet, something about Victoria unsettled her. Victoria carried herself too confidently. She wasn't fawning over the luxury like some of the newer passengers. She didn't act as though she were trying to impress anyone. She simply belonged. and that irritated Gwen in a way she couldn't quite place. Gwen had served celebrities, politicians, and CEOs, but they all played the game. They flaunted their wealth, made sure everyone knew exactly how important they were. Victoria, however, remained eerily composed, as if she had nothing to prove. And to Gwen, that was a problem. As Victoria approached her seat, Gwen took a step forward, placing herself directly in Victoria's path. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but laced with something colder beneath the surface. "I believe there's been a mix-up. May I see your boarding pass?" Victoria barely lifted an eyebrow, but there was something in her gaze, sharp, assessing, unreadable. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound planner, flipping it open with practiced ease before handing Gwen the ticket without a word. Gwen's eyes flickered across the details. Seat 1A, first class, exactly where she was standing. She forced a tight smile. "This section is reserved for our premier clientele. Are you sure this is your seat?" Victoria held her gaze, her expression calm, unshaken. "I don't tend to sit anywhere I don't belong," she said smoothly. The response was measured, professional, but dripping with an authority that sent a ripple of unease through Gwen's spine. There was no arrogance in Victoria's tone, no defensiveness, just a quiet, self-assured certainty, and that irritated Gwen even more. Passengers nearby began to glance over, sensing the tension brewing between the two women. A well-dressed businessman sitting across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, watching with mild curiosity. A middle-aged socialite, dressed in pearls and diamonds, leaned toward her husband and whispered something under her breath, as if waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Gwen squared her shoulders. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I verify this," she said, her voice clipped, already convinced that a mistake had been made. Victoria didn't move. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her lips pressing into a faint, almost amused curve. "Verify it with who?" she asked. Gwen hesitated. She had expected a nervous reaction, maybe even a hurried explanation. Anything but. This quiet, unnerving confidence. "With my supervisor," she said stiffly, motioning toward the front of the cabin. Victoria exhaled softly as if bored. "I'd be happy to wait," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But I'd suggest you verify quickly. This flight isn't going to delay itself." The businessman across the aisle smirked, clearly entertained. The socialite whispered something else to her husband, this time with a small, knowing smile. Gwen's irritation flared. This woman was too calm, too composed, too in control, and Gwen didn't like it one bit. Gwen's breath came faster, her chest tightening as Victoria remained completely unfazed. The billionaire's lack of reaction, the way she refused to cower or even acknowledge Gwen's supposed authority, was infuriating. The weight of the other passengers' eyes pressing in around her only made it worse. Victoria wasn't arguing, wasn't raising her voice. She was simply existing in a space that Gwen had already decided she didn't belong in, and that alone was unbearable. Her fingers twitched at her sides as her frustration turned into something sharper, something reckless. Then, before she even realized what she was doing, Gwen's hand shot forward, her palm smacking hard against Victoria's cheek. The sharp crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from every direction. The businessman dropped his newspaper entirely, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. The socialite let out a small, startled cry, clutching her pearls as if she were the one who had been struck. A younger flight attendant near the galley instinctively took a step forward before stopping herself, her face frozen in horror. No one moved. No one spoke. Victoria's head turned slightly from the impact, her smooth, dark skin marked only by the faintest flush. But she didn't recoil. She didn't reach for her cheek or show any sign of pain. She simply sat there, breathing evenly, her body perfectly still. Gwen's own breath hitched, her palm tingling from the force of the slap, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered through her gaze. Victoria's lack of reaction unsettled her. She had expected anger, maybe even an outburst, something she could use to justify removing her from the cabin. But this eerie, unshakable stillness? It was worse than any retaliation. Slowly, too deliberately, Victoria turned her head back to face Gwen. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto the flight attendants with a quiet, measured intensity. There was no fury in her expression, no humiliation, just a calm, lethal calculation that sent a ripple of cold unease down Gwen's spine. Victoria exhaled through her nose, her lips pressing together briefly before she reached into the pocket of her coat, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. The cabin remained silent, every passenger watching, holding their breath. Victoria lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice, when she spoke, was smooth, steady, and absolute. "This is Victoria Lawson. Handle this immediately." The cabin felt like it had stopped breathing. The slap had sucked all the oxygen out of the space, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the jet engines, suddenly distant, as if the plane itself was waiting to see what would happen next. A young black woman sitting 2 rows back clutched the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, her chest rising and falling as she tried to push down the sickening wave of familiarity washing over her. She had seen this before. Not in a private jet, not against a billionaire, but in classrooms, in stores, on sidewalks. She had seen the same righteous arrogance in the eyes of people who believed they had the right to put someone in their place. And the worst part? No one ever did anything. Would this be the same? Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman frowned, his fingers tightening around the stem of his whiskey glass. He had been enjoying his drink, flipping idly through stock reports, but now his attention was fully locked on the 2 women. His instincts, honed from years in boardrooms where power dynamics shifted with a single misstep, told him this was about to turn into something much bigger than a simple passenger dispute. This wasn't just a flight attendant overstepping. This was a moment of reckoning. He watched Victoria carefully, noting the way she moved with quiet precision, the way she exuded power without having to say a word. The flight attendant had made a mistake, and he knew that whatever came next would decide the course of her future. From the front row, a wealthy white socialite sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as she leaned toward her equally well-dressed companion. "Oh, for God's sake," she muttered under her breath, but just loud enough for those around her to hear. "People will do anything for an upgrade." Her companion, a man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit, merely gave a tight-lipped smile, his gaze flicking between Victoria and Gwen. He looked uncomfortable, as if he wanted to agree but knew better than to say it out loud. The murmurs began, passengers whispering in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Some averted their eyes, pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. Others openly gawked, their gazes bouncing between Victoria's poised form and Gwen's stiff, defensive stance. Gwen could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her. Her pulse pounded against her temples, her stomach twisting in a way she hadn't expected. She had thought this would be easy, a quick power move, a show of authority, a way to put this woman back in her place. But now, standing there with her hand still tingling from the force of the slap, she felt something else creeping in. Something dangerously close to, but she couldn't afford to regret it. Not now, not when people were watching. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "She was being difficult," she said, her voice tight, directed at no one in particular. "I was just trying to do my job." The businessman let out a low breath through his nose. The young black woman pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. The socialite merely scoffed again, sipping her champagne as if this were some minor inconvenience, some little spectacle meant to entertain her. But Victoria, the woman at the center of it all, had still not moved, had still not reacted, had still not given Gwen the emotional explosion she had been expecting. And that was the most unnerving part of all. Gwen squared her shoulders, her chin lifting slightly as she tried to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping over her. She had done what needed to be done. She had put this woman in her place, and now it was only a matter of time before security came in to remove her. Any second now, the flight supervisor would be alerted and Victoria Lawson would be escorted off the plane, humiliated and defeated. Gwen smirked, her confidence returning as she imagined the scene. The passengers would settle down, the socialite would give her an approving nod, the businessman would shake his head, perhaps, but ultimately, order would be restored. She had seen it happen before. People stepped out of line, they were reminded of their place, and life went on. Gwen folded her arms across her chest, her fingers tapping against her elbow as she waited for the inevitable. But nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing against her skin like a weight she couldn't shake. No one moved, no one called for security, no one came to back her up. Her smirk faltered. She glanced toward the galley, expecting one of her fellow flight attendants to step forward, to take her side, to confirm that she had done the right thing. But the younger stewardess who had been standing nearby refused to meet her gaze. Instead, she stared at the floor, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned white. Gwen's fingers twitched. She turned back to Victoria, expecting at least a reaction. Anger, embarrassment, anything. But the woman still hadn't moved. Instead, Victoria sat there, her expression unreadable, her posture as perfect as ever. She wasn't trying to defend herself. She wasn't arguing. She was waiting. And then the cockpit door swung open. The sound made Gwen's stomach drop. Captain James Everett stepped into the aisle, his uniform crisp, his graying hair neatly combed back, his face set in a mask of professional detachment. He didn't rush. He didn't demand answers. He simply scanned the room, taking in the tension, the unease, the way every single passenger had stopped breathing. His gaze landed on Gwen. He didn't speak, didn't reprimand her, but something in his eyes made her chest tighten. He turned to Victoria next, his expression shifting just slightly, but enough for Gwen to notice the quiet deference in his stance. Then he cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, was even, steady, but unshakably firm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words carrying effortlessly through the silent cabin, "I must clarify something important." The air stilled. Every pair of eyes locked onto him. Gwen felt her pulse spike. Victoria Lawson," the captain continued, "is not just a passenger aboard this flight." The unease in Gwen's gut twisted into something colder, sharper. "He is the owner of this aircraft," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the words to settle, "and the airline you are currently flying on." The entire cabin erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scraping of seats as passengers turned to one another in shock. The businessman's eyebrows shot up, his lips parting in disbelief. The young black woman's eyes went wide, her breath catching in her throat. The socialite nearly choked on her champagne. And Gwen felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Gwen's breath caught in her throat, her entire body locking up as the words settled over her like a crushing weight. Her ears rang, her vision narrowing, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. No, this wasn't possible. This had to be a mistake. She had worked in luxury aviation for years, had catered to the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. She knew how to recognize true power when she saw it, and yet her mind struggled to reconcile the calm, collected woman in front of her with what the captain had just said. She turned slowly, her lips parting, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. She can't be..." But she couldn't even finish the sentence because the truth was right in front of her. Victoria Lawson wasn't just a first-class passenger. She owned the entire damn airline. A strangled noise escaped the socialite's throat as she clutched at her pearls, her face draining of color. She had been so sure moments ago, whispering to her husband about Victoria being an opportunist, someone trying to slip into luxury where she didn't belong. Now, her fingers twitched around the stem of her champagne glass, her grip tightening as if she could somehow hold on to the last remnants of her confidence. Her husband, who had initially smirked along with her, cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Victoria at all costs. Across the aisle, the businessman let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. "She's screwed," he murmured under his breath, not even trying to hide his amusement. The energy in the cabin shifted completely. Where there had been tension, uncertainty, even passive complicity, there was now something else entirely: awe, embarrassment, and a sharp, growing sense of realization. Passengers who had been silent observers who had turned their eyes away while Gwen asserted her supposed authority now looked at her with something closer to disgust. Gwen felt it. Felt the shift in power slipping from her fingers like sand. Felt the way every single person on board now saw her for exactly what she was. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Her fingers twitched at her sides as her mind scrambled for a way to fix this, to regain even an ounce of the control she had lost. I didn't know," she stammered, forcing a laugh that fell flat, brittle, hollow. "I just assumed—" "Exactly." Victoria's voice cut through the noise, smooth and lethal. Gwen flinched as if the word had been a physical blow. Victoria still hadn't raised her voice. She didn't have to. The weight of the moment was already suffocating. Gwen turned back to the captain, desperate for backup, for someone to tell her she wasn't about to lose everything. But Everett's face was unreadable, his stance unmovable. There was no saving her. The young black woman who had been gripping her armrest exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and vindication flashing across her face. The socialite, still stiff, finally looked away, stirring her drink with unnecessary focus. Even Gwen's fellow flight attendants remained silent, offering no support. The moment stretched, Wynn's world crumbling by the second, and Victoria, calm and untouchable, simply waited. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto Gwen with quiet precision. The silence stretched unbearably, the weight of it pressing down on every person in the cabin. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, razor-sharp. "Tell me, Ms. Hayes," she began, her tone smooth as glass yet cutting like a blade. "Why exactly did you assume I didn't belong?" Gwen's mouth opened, then closed. Her breath hitched. She knew what was being asked of her, knew what the right answer was, but for the first time in her career she couldn't find the words. The arrogance that had fueled her moments ago had been hollowed out, leaving only raw, exposed panic. I just thought," she started, then faltered. Victoria raised an eyebrow, waiting. Gwen swallowed, glancing around the cabin for support, but found nothing but expectant stares. The businessman was watching intently, his hand resting against his chin, eyes narrowed. The socialite shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly avoiding Victoria's gaze. The young black woman who had clutched her armrest earlier now sat up straighter, her lips pressed into a thin line as she studied Gwen like she was memorizing every second of her unraveling. "You thought what?" Victoria pressed, her voice still maddeningly controlled. Gwen's fingers twitched. I assumed." "Assumed what?" Victoria didn't let her escape. The tension in the cabin became unbearable. Passengers who had turned a blind eye to the confrontation earlier were now feeling the weight of their own complicity, because they too had assumed, they too had watched and done nothing. Gwen's face burned, her skin hot, her chest constricting with something close to shame. "I just didn't think—" "No, you didn't." Victoria's voice remained level, but her words cut through the air like a scalpel. Gwen flinched. Victoria inhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "What bothers me the most," she continued, her voice dropping to something even quieter, even deadlier, "is not that you made a mistake, Miss Hayes. It's that you were so sure that I didn't belong here, so sure that you had the authority to humiliate me in front of an entire cabin full of people. And why is that?" Gwen couldn't answer. Because they both already knew. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. The socialite's fingers trembled around her glass. The young black woman exhaled through her nose, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap itself. The young black woman, sitting a few rows back, inhaled sharply, pressing her lips together as she wiped away a single tear that had slipped down her cheek. She wasn't crying out of sadness, no. It was something deeper, something that had been sitting in her chest for years, waiting for a moment like this, the moment where someone finally stood their ground, where the usual script of silent humiliation and unchallenged arrogance had been ripped apart right in front of her eyes. She had been here before, in different ways, in different places. She had seen the dismissive glances, heard the clipped tones of those who decided she wasn't supposed to be in certain spaces. She had swallowed it, ignored it, walked away because that's what you do. But watching Victoria, watching her refuse to let it slide, refuse to let it be forgotten, it sent a jolt of something powerful through her. Across the aisle, the businessman, who had initially watched with mild curiosity, now sat very still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His mind replayed the scene over and over. The slap, the way he had instinctively dismissed it as an overreaction, the way he had assumed Victoria was in the wrong before he even understood the situation. That realization settled in his stomach like a lead weight. He wasn't like Gwen, wasn't openly hostile, but how many times had he overlooked things like this? How many times had he seen something that didn't sit right and just let it happen? His throat felt dry. He suddenly wished he had spoken up sooner. The socialite, who had been so smug, so quick to whisper assumptions under her breath, now looked painfully small in her oversized designer coat. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace, as if clinging to something familiar would make this moment pass faster. She had judged Victoria instantly, effortlessly, and now she was realizing that judgment had been loud, cruel, and completely wrong. Her fingers tapped against the glass in her hand, but the champagne didn't taste as satisfying anymore. Meanwhile, Gwen stood frozen in place, her confidence crumbling into something desperate and fragile. Her skin felt hot, her chest tight with something close to panic. She had lost control. The moment Victoria turned the conversation on her, she had lost the ability to steer this situation in her favor. She licked her lips, trying to ignore the stares pressing into her from every direction, trying to fight the last shred of authority she thought she had left. If she could just fix this, if she could just explain. "I didn't mean," Gwen stammered, her voice cracking slightly. "I was just trying to—" Victoria lifted a single hand. "Oh." Gwen's words died in her throat. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria let the pause stretch, let Gwen feel the weight of her own actions, pressing down on her from every angle. "Mademoiselle Hayes," Victoria said finally, her voice calm, smooth, absolute. "It's too late." And Gwen knew it was. Gwen's breath came fast and shallow, her chest rising and falling in uneven jerks as the reality of the situation closed in around her like a vice. The walls of the cabin, once familiar and secure, now felt like they were pressing in on her. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the crushing silence that followed Victoria's words, the unspoken judgment hanging thick in the air. Her skin burned with humiliation, her mind racing for a way out, a way to undo what had just happened. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking under the weight of her own desperation. "I thought—" Victoria leaned forward just slightly, her expression unchanged, but her presence suddenly overwhelming. "You thought what?" she said, her voice still maddeningly calm, still controlled, still dangerous. Gwen swallowed hard, her throat dry. Victoria tilted her head, her gaze never breaking. That a black woman couldn't possibly own this airline? The words landed like a thunderclap. Gwen flinched, her lip trembling as her entire body seemed to shrink under Victoria's gaze. Passengers shifted in their seats, the tension wrapping around them so tightly it felt like they might choke on it. The businessman let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head, his earlier amusement now replaced with something else. Disgust. The socialite, who had spent the first half of the flight whispering about Victoria, sat stiffly, her fingers curled tightly around her glass, as if she could squeeze the discomfort out of herself. The young black woman who had wiped away her tears now stared directly at Gwen, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with something deep and personal. Gwen felt herself She shook her head quickly, trying to backpedal, trying to fix it. No, that's not what I just assumed. Assumed what? Victoria pressed, her tone giving nothing away. Gwen's heart pounded violently against her ribs. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Victoria inhaled slowly, exhaling with a quiet precision that made Gwen's stomach churn. "Let me tell you something, Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice as smooth as glass but sharp as a blade. "Your assumption was more than just a mistake. It was a decision to act without thinking, without checking, without questioning the narrative in your head. And do you know what's worse?" Gwen felt like she was suffocating. Victoria didn't wait for an answer. "You were confident," she said. "You were so sure that you were right, so sure that I was in the wrong. You, humiliated me in front of a cabin full of people because you believed, without hesitation, that your judgment was absolute." Gwen's fingers twitched at her sides. I was just trying to do my job," she blurted out, grasping for anything that might save her. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." Victoria let out the smallest, sharpest breath of amusement. "You didn't mean to," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the excuse. She shook her head slowly, disappointment flickering across her face. "That's the problem, isn't it? People like you never mean to." Gwen's stomach twisted violently, a deep, sickening panic taking root in her gut. Passengers murmured softly, some shaking their heads, some watching her with open disapproval. No one was on her side. No one was going to step in, to save her, to fix. She had never felt smaller. She looked at the captain, her eyes pleading, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. She looked at the other flight attendants, but they didn't move. She looked back at Victoria, who simply waited, poised, powerful, unshaken. And Gwen finally understood. There was no escape. The murmur of voices grew louder, a ripple of tension spreading through the cabin as the cockpit door swung open once more. This time, it wasn't another flight attendant or an airline supervisor stepping forward. It was two uniformed police officers. Their presence alone sent a shockwave through the space, the weight of authority settling over the stunned passengers like an invisible force. Their movements were calm, precise, practiced, as if they had done this 100 times before. But the energy in the room told everyone watching that this was different. Gwen went completely still. Her breath hitched in her throat, her stomach twisting so violently she thought she might be sick. The officers stepped forward, their eyes scanning the cabin, assessing the situation with the detached professionalism of men who had seen far worse, but still understood the gravity of what they were walking into. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples, stopped in front of Gwen, his voice steady, firm, leaving no room for interpretation. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone neither cruel nor kind, just final. "You are under arrest for assault." I said I didn't do anything to him, I said. In all getting him and in all keeping him, he slept or ate. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Some passengers immediately turned to one another, whispering in hushed, frantic tones, trying to process what was happening. Others remained frozen, their gazes locked on the unfolding scene. The businessman, who had been watching with quiet calculation, let out a low breath, nodding slightly as if to himself. The young black woman straightened in her seat, her lips parting slightly in disbelief, but there was no shock in her eyes, only an exhausted, knowing recognition. Gwen's knees almost buckled. The blood drained from her face so quickly that her vision blurred at the edges. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Her lips trembled, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Wait, I didn't mean..." Her voice cracked, raw and desperate, but the officer's expression didn't change. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction rolling through the rows of expensive leather seats. The socialite clutched her pearls even tighter, her wide eyes darting between Gwen and the officers, as if she couldn't decide whether to be scandalized or impressed. The businessman shook his head slightly, muttering, Well, she did this to herself. The officer nearest to Gwen took a slow step forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs with a swift, practiced motion. The cold, unmistakable sound of metal clicking open cut through the air like a gunshot. Gwen took an instinctive step back, her body trembling. No, please, you don't understand. I didn't mean... She was cut off as one of the officers gently but firmly took hold of her wrist, turning her body slightly as the first cuff snapped shut around her wrist. A strangled sob tore from her throat. Please, I didn't mean it. I was just trying to do my job. But no one spoke up for her. Not the captain. Not the other flight attendants. Not the passengers who had sat in complicit silence while she berated a woman who had more power in her pinky finger than Gwen had in her entire career. Victoria watched the scene unfold with the same unshaken composure she had maintained since the moment Gwen had laid hands on her. There was no gloating in her expression, no smugness, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that this was the inevitable result of Gwen's own choices. The second cuff locked into place, and Gwen let out a choked, gasping sob. She turned, wild-eyed, pleading, "Please," she whispered, the humiliation sinking in like a stone in her chest. "I didn't mean to." Victoria met her gaze, her expression unreadable, then tilted her head slightly. "Yes, you did," she said, her voice soft but absolute. Gwen's sobs turned into quiet whimpers as the officers guided her down the aisle, her hands cuffed behind her back, her once proud posture now reduced to a small, shuffling figure moving toward her downfall. Each step was a reminder of the humiliation she had brought upon herself, a walk of shame witnessed by the very people who, only moments ago, had allowed her to wield power unchecked. No one defended her, no one protested, no one reached out to stop what was happening. The businessman leaned back in his seat, watching with an expression that was half disapproval, half inevitable recognition. He had worked with people like Gwen before, people who would let their own unchecked biases fester, unchecked and unchallenged, until they finally tripped over their own arrogance. This wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about years of entitlement catching up with her in a single spectacular collapse. The socialite shifted in her seat, avoiding Victoria's gaze, suddenly very aware of how much she had misjudged the situation. She sipped her champagne, but the taste had turned bitter. The young black woman who had clutched her armrest earlier let out a slow, measured breath, her fingers loosening their grip. She had seen injustice before, had felt it firsthand, but this time, for once, the right person was facing the consequences. And through it all, Victoria never moved. She remained seated, poised, powerful, completely in control. She didn't watch Gwen leave. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Instead, she turned her gaze to the rest of the cabin, letting her eyes sweep across the faces of the passengers who had watched it all unfold. Some met her gaze. Others quickly looked away, ashamed. When she spoke, her voice was steady, rich, unshakable. "Let this be a lesson," she said, each word crisp, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Respect is not a privilege, it is a right, and no one has the power to take that away from another human being." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding solemnly, others looking down at their hands, at their drinks, at anything that would keep them from confronting the truth of their own complicity. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engines humming softly in the background. Then, a single slow click. The businessman, still seated, still watching, brought his hands together once, twice, 3 times. And then the sound grew. The young black woman joined in, her applause measured, firm. A few more passengers hesitated, then followed. The socialite, still clutching her pearls, hesitated, then set down her glass and clapped. The cabin filled with applause, not loud, not thunderous, but something deeper, something earned. Victoria didn't react. She simply let the moment breathe. She had already won. The world saw everything. Within hours, a passenger's phone recording of the slap was uploaded online, and like wildfire, it spread across social media, news outlets, and television screens around the globe. The impact of Gwen's hand against Victoria's face, the eerie silence that followed, the way Victoria didn't flinch but simply turned back with the quiet confidence of a woman who had already won, it was all there, captured in crystal clear detail. The headlines were relentless. Flight attendant slaps black billionaire, instantly regrets it. CEO Victoria Lawson schools the industry on respect. Racism at 400,000 feet. How one woman's assumptions cost her everything. The video amassed millions of views in a matter of hours, shared across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, with captions ranging from outrage to awe. People dissected every second of the footage. The way Gwen's smug confidence transformed into raw panic, the shift in power when the captain revealed Victoria's identity, and the undeniable satisfaction of seeing justice delivered in real time. Comment sections exploded. He handled that with more grace than I ever could. If someone slapped me like that, I'd be in handcuffs, not Gwen. The way she just turned back and stared at Gwen, chill. Let's be real, if Victoria had reacted even slightly aggressively, people would have called her the problem. This is what black women have to deal with every day. Gwen thought she could pull rank on the wrong one. Instant karma? News channels picked up the story, panel discussions aired on talk shows, and journalists scrambled to uncover details about both women. Who was Victoria Lawson, and how did she become one of the most powerful business figures in the world? Who was Gwen Hayes, and did she have a history of discrimination? Then, the deeper reports surfaced. Former airline employees began coming forward, sharing stories of Gwen's past behavior. Anonymous accounts described incidents where she had treated certain passengers differently, enforcing rules more harshly on those she deemed out of place in first class. There were murmurs of complaints filed against her that had mysteriously never gone anywhere. The airline was now under intense scrutiny. Journalists hounded their PR team for a response. Civil rights organizations began issuing statements demanding systemic change in the airline industry. Celebrities and activists took to Twitter calling for consequences, not just for Gwen, but for the broader culture that had allowed her behavior to go unchecked. Meanwhile, Victoria remained silent. She didn't give interviews, she didn't post statements, she didn't need to. The world had already heard her loud and clear. Gwen sat in her tiny apartment, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating the deep lines of stress on her face. She had barely slept. The world outside had moved on, but for her, it felt like everything had stopped. Her career, her reputation, her future, gone. The email from the airline had come swiftly, colder than she expected for someone who had given over 20 years of service. Ethic, Miss Hayes, effective immediately. Your employment with our company has been terminated due to gross misconduct. We appreciate your years of service and wish you the best in your future endeavors. That was it. No chance to explain, no severance, just erased. She had tried to fight it, had called HR, but the response was the same every time. Her actions had been recorded, and the decision was final. She had checked job boards, contacted old colleagues, but no one was returning her calls. Airlines had blacklisted her. Other luxury service industries wouldn't touch her. But it wasn't just the depression, it was the exposure. The deeper the internet dug, the worse it got. Old co-workers spoke to reporters, anonymously at first, but then more boldly as public outrage grew. They painted a picture of a woman who had always enforced the rules differently depending on who was in front of her. Complaints that had been quietly buried by management were now being uncovered. Passengers shared stories. I remember her, she gave me hell on a flight once for asking for a drink while the man next to me got his without question. She always made me feel like I didn't belong in first class. Guess we know why. News segments aired back-to-back discussions on racial bias in the airline industry, using Gwen as the face of the problem. Her name became synonymous with discrimination and downfall. She deleted her social media, but it was too late. Her face was in memes, in think pieces, in headlines. And no matter where she went, she was now the cautionary tale everyone used to prove a point. Victoria didn't disappear into the background. She didn't let the moment pass as just another viral controversy. She made it a turning point. Within days, a formal statement was released from her office. Not through a press conference, not through emotional interviews, but through action. The airline under her leadership announced sweeping reforms that would not only change her company, but set a new industry standard. The first policy was mandatory anti-bias training for every single employee, from flight attendants to top executives. It wasn't going to be some performative, once-a-year seminar where people nodded along and went back to business as usual. This would be an ongoing, intensive education on recognizing and eliminating implicit bias, and those who refused to comply wouldn't have a place in her company. Next came a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. No warnings, no second chances. If an employee was caught treating passengers unfairly based on race, gender, class, or any other prejudice reasoning, they were gone immediately. But the most significant change was a confidential reporting system for passengers and crew, a direct channel that would allow anyone, employee or customer, to report mistreatment without fear of retaliation. Complaints would be reviewed by an independent board, ensuring no more buried reports, no more swept-under-the-rug incidents, no more silent injustices. The announcement shook the airline industry. Other major carriers scrambled to review their own policies, forced into action by the sheer pressure of public demand. Civil rights organizations praised Victoria's decisive leadership. Consumer trust in her airline skyrocketed. She had turned one act of prejudice into a movement for accountability. She didn't just win, she changed the game. Victoria sat in her office, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The lights of Manhattan stretched out before her, a glittering sea of power and possibility. She held a glass of water in her hand, not drinking, just holding, feeling the coolness against her palm as she let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like days. It would have been so easy to lash out, to react in anger, to demand justice in the heat of the moment. No one would have blamed her. In fact, some might have expected it, wanted it even. But she knew better. She had learned long ago that power wasn't in how loud you got. It was in how much control you had over yourself when everyone else lost theirs. She turned her chair slightly, letting her gaze drift to the framed photo on the edge of her desk. It was an old one. Her mother standing outside their small apartment, her arms crossed, the fierce look in her eyes so familiar it made Victoria's chest tighten. "Never let them see you break, V." Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a lesson that had been drilled into her since childhood. The world wouldn't give her the luxury of losing control. People like her weren't allowed the same anger, the same outbursts, the same second chances. She had carried that weight her entire life, but in that moment on the plane, when Gwyn's hand had struck her face, she had made a choice. She wouldn't break. She would win. She set the glass down, exhaling slowly. This fight had never been just about her. It was for every black woman who had ever been questioned in spaces she had every right to be in. It was for every person who had been talked down to, underestimated, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. It was for the countless stories like hers that had never gone viral, that had never been given justice. She smiled, not in triumph, not in arrogance, but in certainty. The world had changed, and she had made sure it would never go back. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of her desk as she thought about everything that had unfolded. The slap, the silence, the shift in power. It wasn't just an isolated moment on a plane. It was a mirror reflecting something far bigger than just one woman's arrogance. She wondered how many people had watched that video and seen a part of their own lives in it. How many had been in her seat before, questioned, dismissed, treated as though they didn't belong. How many had bitten their tongues, swallowed their anger, let it go because they knew that fighting back would only make things worse for them. But this time was different. This time, the world had watched. And now the real question remained. What would people do with what they had seen? If you were in Victoria's position, how would you have responded? Would you have stayed calm knowing the world expected you to explode? Or would you have fought back in the way so many before you never got the chance to? Does Gwen deserve a second chance? Or did she seal her fate the moment she let her own bias dictate her actions? Should she be forgiven? Or is accountability the only real lesson in a world where people like her have too often walked away without consequences? Have you ever witnessed bias or discrimination? Maybe it was at work, in school, in a store, on the street. Maybe it wasn't directed at you, but you saw it happen. Did you speak up? Or did you let it go, convincing yourself it wasn't your place to intervene? What can we do every single day to ensure respect isn't just a word we say, but a standard we uphold? How do we make sure that moments like this don't just go viral and fade away, but instead create real, lasting change? Victoria had answered that question for herself. She had taken the power that was already hers and used it to build something bigger than just her own success. And now the question was, what would the rest of the world do? Because respect is not a privilege, it is a right. And real power, it comes from knowing exactly who you are and making sure the world never forgets it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you reflect on the world we live in and the way we treat one another, then don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Make sure stories like this aren't just moments of outrage, but catalysts for real change. Too often injustices happen in silence, witnessed but unchallenged, allowed to fade into the background. But awareness leads to action. The more we hold people accountable, the more we demand respect as a basic right and not a privilege reserved for the few, the closer we get to a world where dignity isn't conditional, it's expected. So, if you believe in what this story stands for, like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power we all hold. Because change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we decide that silence is no longer an option.